Hey everybody, welcome to ReadyTech. Super happy on this week's episode to welcome Marty Cagan. Marty founded the Silicon Valley Product Group in 2003 to pursue his interest in helping others create successful products through his writing, speaking, advising, and coaching. Previously, Marty served as an executive responsible for defining and building products for some of the most successful companies in the world, such as HP Labs, Netscape Communications, and eBay. Some of you will also know Marty as an author of Inspired and Empowered. Marty is invited as a speaker to conferences and companies worldwide and is a graduate of the University of California at Santa Cruz and of the Stanford University's Executive Institute. In this episode, there's a little bit of controversy. We cover the difference between feature teams and product teams. We discuss SAFe being nothing to do with Agile and how you become a true product company. So without further ado, let's jump in. Marty, welcome. Pleasure to have you on ReadyTech. How are you?
I'm good. Thanks for inviting me.
Even before the COVID-19 pandemic, Agile and Product was a hot topic. Some companies came into the crisis with Agile and Product practices, and as we know, some had it thrust upon them. Now, Marty, I know you've seen this over and over, teams calling themselves squads, scrum teams, dev teams, all the while, and in some cases, even celebrating the fact that they're a product organization or team, but actually, as we know, in truth, they're serving the needs of the stakeholder or of the business and not the customer. You look under their organizational structure or their team design and at their operating model, and it's delivery, maybe even feature teams disguised as product with zero empowerment. So to you, what is a true product company?
Yeah, there's some big topics inside there. First, let's separate the notion of Agile from this discussion. Because Agile, of course, figuratively speaking, an Agile organization is one that, for example, could take advantage of the opportunities that emerge from something as, disruptive as a pandemic. That's what we mean by figuratively. Whether or not, when we mean literally Agile, there are a set of delivery processes that engineers use to ship code that I strongly recommend. They're absolutely, but they can be used in good product companies or bad product companies. It doesn't really matter. It's orthogonal to that. The most common processes are Scrum and Kanban. And then some companies use XP, and most companies I know use really blends of those. And but they're just delivery processes. They don't really say one way or another whether or not you're going to have an empowered organization, whether or not you're going to be able to respond to new opportunities quickly. That is a higher level concept. So there are certain processes out there that are so bad that they get in the way of a company's ability to try to respond to opportunities. We could talk about that if you want, but you didn't raise that. So I'm assuming you mean conventional Agile processes. And that's just the way to think about it is that's just how the team does delivery. They're good practices. They're basically based on small, frequent stream of releases. That's a good thing to do no matter what. So let's now talk about that bigger question, like what does it mean to have an organization that can respond to new opportunities? And that's what most people generally mean when we talk about either a product-led or customer-led organization. I prefer customer-led, but people use them both. I just don't, you get into this power thing, marketing-led, engineering-led, sales-led, product-led. Yeah. But mostly when we mean product-led, what we really mean is customer-led. So that doesn't mean customers tell you what to build. That's a whole different problem. That's not that. But it does mean that the primary purpose of your teams, which is where you were going, I think, with that question, the primary purpose for the teams are there to actually serve customers in ways that the customers love, but work for our business. That's really the mission of a product team in a product company, as opposed to, unfortunately, in most organizations that aren't Agile, that are not empowered, they have a very different, when I say not Agile, again, not loosely speaking Agile, the way they're set up is the teams are there to serve the business, not the customers. So stakeholders inside the company, executives in the company are choosing what gets done and why. There's a very different purpose there. And because of that different purpose, of course, there's a lot of differences in how the teams are staffed and how the teams work, and frankly, what they're even responsible for.
I just want to pick out a couple of things and reiterate something that you said there, which is XP, Scrum, Kanban, or a blend of all of the three are delivery processes. So just because you are doing one of those delivery methods, it does not mean you are product or a product organization. If I may, I would like to jump straight into some hard truths. So off the bat, can you give us some hard truths?
Well, there's a lot of them, I'd say. What's tricky about doing tech products is you actually have to get a lot of things right. And what that means is really any number of things that go wrong could really derail your efforts. So it does take getting a lot of things right. And that's why these are big topics. That said, there are some really common, at the root of a lot of the things that go wrong, probably the biggest to me is the belief that we can predict how our customers are going to respond and which of our ideas are going to make money. That is probably at the root of the issue, which is really an arrogance issue. Most executives don't like when I frame it that way, but they believe that their ideas are awesome ideas. And of course, we know from many, even the best companies in the world, that most ideas are not going to work. They are not going to make the money you hoped. They are not going to solve the problem you had hoped. And that's the reality. Somewhere between 20 and 50% at best will work. So if you can come to terms with that, if in your heart you agree with that, then you can change how you work to live with that reality, which means really what it means is you have to get good at separating good ideas from bad quickly. And, we say, this is just another way of framing. You might have heard this. You want to fall in love with the problem, not the solution. And that's where that comes from.
Yes, absolutely heard about falling in love with a problem. And if you're spending time, effort, and energy in an organization to hire your best and brightest, your pioneers, you need to be giving them problems to solve. Otherwise, every day of the week, they will vote with their feet. They do not want to be handed solutions. They want to be handed problems to solve. So there's two types of approaches that I see, which is your kind of classic command and control output model and your customer-led kind of outcome model, which is centered around value and the customer. On your journey, what do you see the differences in the kind of command and control or kind of customer-led approaches? Because, from my vantage point, there's many kind of different layers or many different reasons. Certainly in the classic command and control model, whether that's around that just simply not prepared to be vulnerable, that perhaps looking for people to blame, or they just simply have never worked within a good product company before. So what is it that you see on your journey?
Well, these are really, in the product world, these are the two kinds of companies out there as far as I can see. They're either like Netflix believes you lead with context, not control, or they're, like you were saying, command and control companies. And in most cases that I know, the people in the command and control style companies have never actually worked in a good product company. So it's not like they're intentionally choosing that path. It's that they don't know. That's all they know. And in fairness, even though drives me nuts, but in fairness, the clear majority are command and control style companies. But the best companies out there, whether it's the Amazons or Googles or Netflix or Apples or Spotify or Slack or Stripe, the best companies are basically empowering. They don't believe in the command and control model. Now, partly because they don't believe in command and control because they they believe that their teams are actually in a better position to get good answers. And partly it has to do with, with trusting the organization, trusting that the people are doing their job. So, there are different reasons or explanations for it, but fundamentally, it's the command and control versus the empowered model out there. Those are the two main models I see.
From the product side, and you touch on one very important or two very important words there are empowerment and trust. And I think a lot of that sometimes also boils down to your hiring and the trust that you have or the capability that you bring into the organization. And I know in a number of your articles or your books, you talk about the product manager being that kind of mini CEO almost, and organizations really need to hire these people very, very well. These people should be really accelerating your capability as a business, but also delivering outcome to your customer. So is this really, where do you see the kind of the empowerment or kind of the trust lacking? Is that because the people, the command and control models bringing in are of lesser of capability than these people under the title of product when actually they're just project management? What are some of the perhaps pitfalls that these businesses in the command and control model are making?
Well, the first thing I should clarify, this notion of a good product manager is the CEO of their product, which I didn't coin. That's something that's been around a long time in observation. But I want to be clear, that is absolutely irrelevant to a command and control style company. That makes no sense in a command and control style company. That phrase came out of the empowered product companies. And fundamentally, it's because in a command and control company, you still have product teams, but they are there to, like you said, sir, we were talking about serve the business. So the business, if you will, is making the choices about the solutions that will be built. The product manager in that model is really just responsible for herding the cats, getting it designed, getting it built, getting it QA tested, getting it deployed. That is project management. And so if you talk about somebody like that and say, oh, that's the CEO of the product, you'll just get laughed out of the building. On the other hand, if it's an empowered product team company, like we were talking about, and instead of being given a roadmap of a bunch of features to build, instead, the team is given by leadership one or two critical problems to solve. Now we have to actually figure out a solution to that problem, which means a solution that's valuable, feasible, usable, and viable. And engineers worry about feasibility and designers worry about usability, but it's the product manager on an empowered team that worries about value and viability. And it's not an accident that that's what a startup CEO worries about too, value and viability.
Yeah.
So that's where that comes from. It's only meaningful in an empowered product team company. And that's why the job of a product manager is so dramatically different in a feature team company or a command and control versus in an empowered product team. A lot of people that have only worked in one don't even really understand when you're referring to the other. It makes no sense. So I fully appreciate when people just give me a blank stare when I talk about a good product manager as the CEO of the product. I know where they're coming from. They've probably never worked in that kind of company, and they're trying to reconcile what I'm saying with the project managers that they know. And they're like, no, I don't think so. They're not the CEO of anything. So that's really what's going on.
But I also think you talk about getting laughed at from the business. But if you then also go to market to try and hire this mini CEO, they've left the business within months, even maybe within weeks. Because as soon as you bring in that kind of proper product manager into that type of operating model, you very quickly get found out because they simply vote with their feet. And that is an obvious validation or a litmus test of your model, because you're bringing in this mini CEO that thinks like that and has been in an empowered organization before, sees that you're very much in that feature-led or in that output-led model. And the litmus test is actually the people move on.
Yeah, I get, especially during this pandemic, actually quite a few people that have said, called and said, I made a big mistake. I didn't even know there were companies like this. I don't understand why they would do this. They realize the most valuable companies in the world would never work this way. And I've had this conversation now too many times. The truth is the people that do know how to work well in an empowered product team company, they're very in demand. So usually they know enough to watch out for, you only make this kind of mistake once about going to the wrong place. Now, sometimes you're brought in because the leader wants to change. And so they want a leader, a product person that's been there, done that at a good company, and they want that person to lead the change. So that's, of course, a different story. But yeah, it's very difficult. By the way, it's just as true. I know engineers that have called me that said, this is crazy. Can you believe I went to this company? They're paying me great, but they want me to basically just shut up and code. They don't want me to actually help invent the solution. So there's no way I'm sticking around. Or designers that say, this is a classic, the designers that say, all they want me to do is put lipstick on a pig here. That's the great line for designers because, it's all the solutions are pigs. They're terrible solutions. And all they're doing is putting the company color scheme on it. That is not what a professional product designer was trained to do. So yeah, occasionally people find themselves in a feature team company. They either try to change it or they usually move on.
I'm going to ask a question about the kind of because the differences do run deep between product teams, which are outcome and empowered, versus feature teams, which are kind of output. I'm going to ask you to explain that in a second. But what do you think? And as you were talking, then it really did get me thinking. Is that to some it's so obvious because you've been part of these companies, whether companies are just naturally born that way because they're born into a world which is so product or outcome led. But there's so much information out there, your own literature and your own things that you do in community-led stuff. That information is out there, but yet we see these organizations, these people continuously revert to type. Is that because, we've just always done it this way? Or what is it? Is it leadership? For some reason, it seems like common sense, but in the other times you look at things and you go deeper into organizations, you think, how are you still acting like this? Why do people still do it over and over again?
Well, look, this is going to be a little sensitive, but it's the truth as far as I can tell. There is more good voices today on product than ever, but there is way more bad, ridiculous voices in product than ever. And it can be very hard for someone to tell the difference. Realistically, probably 9 out of 10 articles I read online are ridiculously bad, in my opinion. When I say bad, I don't mean like not a good quality article. What they're really doing is just propagating the old feature team model.
The old rhetoric. Yeah.
Yes. And so and most, what do people do? They get training. Well, depends who is training for them. If there's somebody that's never worked like this, then what do you expect? And so we have the blind leading the blind. And the numbers are not in the favor of empowered product teams. There's many more people around the world that have never worked in an environment like that than it have. And so it can be very difficult for leaders and product managers and even designers and engineers to get, what I would consider helpful advice if they want to get into empowered product teams. It can be very difficult. And so we do have kind of a mess in our industry there.
Let's go back to the original kind of statement of you're in a feature team when you may be disguised as or trying to be a product organization. And you've actually wrote an article on this and I've read it a number of times. And some organizations that I've been in, I'm looking around me like, okay, I'm in the middle of this. The difference does run deep between the two products versus feature teams. So can you just go a little bit deeper for us and explain those differences?
Sure. It's pretty easy to spot when you talk to anybody on the team. My favorite is that you could tell in about 5 minutes when you talk to one of the engineers. So let's see. Feature teams basically are given roadmaps of features and projects. That's what most roadmaps are, prioritized lists of features and projects, which you have to realize that's output. Those are specific product ideas that may or may not solve some underlying problem. A lot of times the teams that are asked to build those roadmap items don't even know what the underlying problem is. They can guess, but they're not sure. And they certainly don't know what the business results are that they're trying to be held accountable to. So they just are given a roadmap and they're asked to implement those features on the roadmap as fast as they can. And it's all about output. If things don't, let's say you do implement that feature, but the stakeholder that wanted it because they wanted some business result, but they don't get that business result. Well, the stakeholder will start complaining to the product team that you did a crappy job. And of course, the product team will probably say, well, we didn't choose this. We didn't even think this would have been the best way to do this. So you get a lot of feature pointing. So you really have no accountability. And it's worth realizing you can't really have accountability if you give a team a solution and that solution doesn't work. On an empowered product team, instead of giving them the solution, which is what roadmaps have, you give them problems to solve. This is the real intention of OKRs, by the way, the technique. That's what they were for. This is also why OKRs don't work with feature teams, which is why so many companies have had frustrating experiences with OKRs because they're feature team organizations, and that's a cultural mismatch. But in an empowered team company, that's what they're for. They're given the objective is the problem to solve. The key results are the measures of success. And a team is then empowered. This is what it means to be empowered, to go figure out the best solution they can to that particular problem. And if the first idea, second idea, third idea, if those ideas don't work, they're not done until they solve that problem. And now, of course, because they are empowered to figure out the best solution, they can also be held accountable to those results. You can tell the team, look, you said you could get us a 3% improvement in this conversion rate or whatever, and you weren't able to. So let's talk about that. You can have an accountability discussion.
If I'm listening to this and I'm a product manager or a feature manager in that, and I want to maybe perform a litmus test on myself to think, well, where am I? If I'm unsure, I'm out there and I'm listening and I'm thinking, where do I sit in that feature or product? Would you just simply ask yourself the question, are you solving problems or are you delivering a backlog? Are there any other litmus tests that you would maybe suggest people that could ask themselves right now in their role to validate whether they're output or outcome?
Yeah, there's three questions really that I suggest are the litmus test, and you just picked one of them, right? So the first one you could say is, am I given problems to solve, or am I already given somebody's idea of a solution to build? That's the first. The second is, have I been given the tools we need to succeed? In other words, do we have a cross-functional product team with the skills we need? Normally that's product design and engineering. The final one is, how am I measured? Am I measured by output, shipping on time, on budget, or am I measured by business results? If I'm measured by results, that's a sign that the litmus test, we have an empowered team. If I'm measured by output, it's probably a feature team, or even worse, a delivery team.
I want to be a little bit maybe controversial and provocative here, and intentionally started to see new frameworks or methods in the product space, like SAFe as a particular example. Is that really just the modern day program management or repackaged kind of waterfall? Like, what would you put that under? Still delivery?
Well, yeah, SAFe and less. These are examples of processes that are, the irony is SAFe has got it stands for Scaled Agile Framework, but it's not agile at all. It's not in spirit and it's not in practice. It's very clever marketing of waterfall, designed to appeal to leaders, in my opinion, that have no idea what they're doing. And so that will preclude the kind of innovation that a tech product company depends on, which is why it's really not, these processes are not used in tech product companies. They're used in big banks, big IT organizations, big insurance companies, things like that, where they have not needed in the past innovation. But yeah, that's what's really going on, is well beyond. But in that model of things like SAFe and less, The teams are the engineering teams, dev teams are just there to ship code. They are not there to actually come up with solutions to problems.
Agile fall, let's call it.
There's a lot of fake Agile is the other one that's often, but it's got nothing to do with Agile. That's just marketing. And anybody who falls for that kind of gets what they deserve.
You've written extensively about product failure. Can you tell us some of those root causes?
Well, we've hit on a few of them already. A lot of those root causes stem from not knowing what you can't know. So, for example, if you pretend you know how much money you're going to make with every idea, you do these ridiculous business cases where you make up numbers about how much money you're going to make and how expensive it's going to be to build, even though a team has not even looked at any of this, validated any of this. And even just the fact that you quickly fall in love with some particular solution before you've seen if customers will really respond to that. So a lot of this arrogance of thinking you know what you don't know and what you can't know and not admitting what you don't know is at the root of many of those issues. These roadmaps cause a lot of trouble. There's nothing really evil in a roadmap in itself, as long as the items in that roadmap come from the team after they've discovered it's an effective thing to build. The problem is that's almost never how it's done. It's more done as an input where somebody hands you a roadmap and they just, made these mistakes before on what went into it. But, there's a lot of the root issues that relate to risk. The risks are not addressed early enough. We should be addressing whether a solution is going to be valuable, usable, feasible, viable before we write a line of code, not after. A lot of the issues relate to how we solve problems. It doesn't work to have the idea where somebody like a product manager or anybody writes a list of requirements and throws it over the wall to a designer to make it pretty, and then they throw that over the wall to a bunch of engineers to code. That is literally waterfall, and that is not how innovation happens, because innovation usually happens the exact opposite way. The engineers see something that's just now possible. We end up changing experience and changing functionality based on what's now possible. I mean, these are very fundamental differences between how feature teams work and how good product companies work. But that's what's going on.
We haven't touched much on leadership. We've talked about, delivery, output, and outcome in terms of product and empowerment. But what is the role of leadership in a great product company?
That's really the key, honestly. If a company wants to change from feature team company to an empowered product team company, it really starts with leadership. And I don't mean that in a minor way. First of all, it really starts with the CEO. If the CEO is not on board, like if the CEO just decides, I don't want to deal with that, I'll appoint a chief digital officer and just sort of push it over there. It rarely happens. Those digital transformations rarely make any difference because, as you'll see, changing from a feature team to a product team company impacts much more than product design and engineering. It impacts finance, it impacts HR, it impacts sales, marketing, legal, everything. So without the support of the CEO is rarely going to happen. Then probably the most critical decision that CEO's got to make if they really want to change is who is in charge of product and who is in charge of technology, those two leaders. Normally the CPO and the CTO. If those leaders have not been there, done that at a real product company, it is going to be very difficult. Now, what usually happens is they bring those people in and they then start coaching and developing the people that are there in the new skills that are required. In some companies, and this can work too, in some companies, the leader of product and or technology have never done it at a good company, but the CEO believes they can be developed into strong leaders. And so what they'll do is hire like an executive coach for the technology leader and an executive coach for the product leader. there are coaches that specialize in those two types of leaders. And those coaches will help them through the next couple years because, again, they haven't done it before. So they need somebody to kind of show them what they need to do to their organizations. And it's funny because I explain what the responsibilities are to a lot of product design and engineering leaders. And I usually get two responses. The first response is, oh my gosh, we're not doing any of that. And so we realized we have been way off in a different, it's a very different kind of business if you're in a feature team company. So they realize they haven't been doing any of it. That's a problem. And the second thing they realize is it's hard. How do you learn to do that? Because what we're talking about is a good product vision, a real product strategy, an intelligent team topology, team objectives. These are hard things. And they're going like, where do I learn to do that? I've never, if I've worked at a good product company before, that's where you've learned it. But if you haven't, they're like, well, who's going to help me learn that? And well, partly that's why I wrote the second book was because I heard that from so many leaders that wanted to learn the best practices, but nobody had ever showed them. But the other way, like I said, is with a product leader coach or a technology leader coach. There are very good coaches out there that's what they do. But one way or another, if those leaders are not able to do what I just described, vision, strategy, topology, objectives, if they can't do that, it's not going to happen because nobody will be there to make sure that every product team has competent people on that team, especially competent product managers, skilled designers, skilled engineers.
Talking about major fundamental behavioral change, but you're also, and this is sometimes one of the things that certainly I see, is that you see teams forming within cross-functional organization, within a cross-functional outfit. So you have your design lead, your engineering lead, your product lead, but actually the fundamental operating model, and you touched on it there, your processes have to change, your finance, your planning, your all of that. But actually, in a lot of cases, they actually don't. So you don't have dynamic resource reallocation. You, from a budgeting or financing perspective, you have a really rigid budgeting structure that only allows you to reallocate finance every year, so do you see often that is a case, that there's many organizations that do change into cross-functional teams and you look at them on paper and you think, oh yeah, you've got that cross-functional, but once you scratch further beneath the surface, there's still a lot of rigidity in actually the way that business is operating, typically around finance.
Oh yeah. And it's not just finance. Like I've literally seen HR people that, They literally won't create the jobs that are relevant in a product company. They just want to stay in the old feature team IT model. And so they can't even, it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. They can't even hire the people they need to hire.
Absolutely.
100%. So that's why we've taken an increasingly harder line on this, that if the CEO is not on board, it is very hard to pull this off. Because of what we're talking about now. The CEO doesn't have to have the experience, but the CEO does need to understand and provide the support, the air cover, we say, for these changes.
You touch on actually a really interesting point around HR there, because that's also another fundamental kind of element. Because if you need to dynamically resource or people reallocate into the different teams, but then you've got quite a rigid HR structure of levels and titles, and it doesn't necessarily allow you then to bring in the necessary capability to kind of react that way, then that really is quite an impediment to achieving the intended outcome, right?
Huge. And I mean, I've also seen companies where a combination of the IT, it's usually IT. It's like a CIO, not a CTO, but HR and that CIO will say, oh, our policy here is to outsource the engineers. And I have to tell them, well, then your policy is to go out of business if that's really what you're trying to do. You need to realize this is a core competency. What's going on is they don't realize the role technology needs to play. They're treating it like a cost center. They're not treating it like a profit center. So these are not minor differences. It's not that hard to take a given feature product team and train them to be an empowered product team. What's hard is to provide them an environment at their company that lets them do good work. That's the much harder thing.
It circles back to trust and empowerment in that scenario and leveraging internal capability, because unless you turn to technology and see technology as an enabler or an accelerator to that destination, you will fail every time. And do you think, I think I'm answering my own question here, but more from a validation point of view, where we see this legacy culture that is often deep rooted in the services or banking or manufacturing sectors, which does bring challenges. And you see them starting to perhaps wanting to drive transformation, but they're trying to do it almost POCing their way to scale rather than actually fundamentally making it part of that core behavior. And does it all center back around leadership? Does it all center back around the CEO has to back this? Otherwise, what is the point? Or are there any other things that you've identified on your journey that it's leadership and something?
Well, I mean, I do think leadership is the key. And I am encouraged, though. I mean, sometimes what it takes is sort of a near-death experience for the company, for the leadership to realize, oh, this is important. We need to start taking this seriously. The problem is in so many companies, they've got, especially in the US, this is a real problem, government protection, too big to fail, stuff like this. So, for example, for many years, the big financial companies, the big banks, the big insurance companies, they wouldn't change. They didn't want to change. Frankly, can't blame them that much. They had all they had to do basically was just keep making money, and they didn't pay attention to anything until, I love it. There's a startup recently. Well, they're past the startup stage, but they're working like a startup, which is what I like. It's Stripe. You may have heard of Stripe,
yeah.
Financial services company. But Stripe is literally putting the fear of God into the CEOs of big financial institutions, because now there's a competitor coming along that is really punching above their weight. They are doing things that, a lot of those big leaders thought that others couldn't be able to do. For the first time, I'm starting to see serious interest from the CEOs of these big companies that really weren't worried about anything for a long time. So that gives me hope. It gives me hope that they'll get better, or, so a company like Stripe will continue to take their customers away.
You're not just seeing that across the finance and payment sector, you're seeing that across all other sectors. And it literally is, I see the moment being, as you say, a do or die moment, because consumer behavior, customer behavior is fundamentally changing how they're looking to engage with those previous services, or it's a leadership-led decision. Then really, I see the two main catalysts for change is a leadership-led, or literally, as you put it, a do or die or near-death experience kind of moment. Are there any other catalysts, or would you say those are the two fundamentals?
Well, those are the two big ones. Usually we frame it as fear or greed. Fear that they're going to be disrupted, or greed because they want to make as much money as companies like Amazon are making, and they want to be valued like that. But there is one other, which is in some companies, they realize the retention is a serious issue, and that they will retain people much better when they empower them versus when they treat them like soldiers or something and do what I say. That can be another reason to do it. But the first two are the most common.
And you made a really fantastic point there, actually, about retention, because nowadays the competition for talent has always been a problem globally. It's not a UK problem, a US problem. It's a global problem. And whether or not, your ability to attract and retain and develop the best people is what are going to allow you to achieve your strategic considerations. And you're seeing certainly the younger generation kind of coming through. They want that empowerment. They want the freedom. They want to solve problems. They want to work on things that are meaningful, that they can really intellectually stimulate themselves. And you will retain your best and brightest if you empower. So could not agree with you more. And it's a nice final question there to end with people. And I always like to try and give something back where we can, especially maybe people thinking about wanting to get into product management, or perhaps people thinking about a career pivot, as an example. So if any of the listeners are out there thinking about, this is for me, I'm really interested in solving customer problems and I want to be that either that mini CEO or I want to be really making a difference. What would your advice be?
I have got that question so many times in the past that recently I wrote an article called Product Management Start Here. It was meant because actually a lot of times people, when they ask that, they're frustrated because there's so much conflicting stuff out there online. And so I literally wrote start here, and I list stuff that I've written, but I list stuff that other people that I believe are very good have written, and try to get them off on the right foot. So yeah, that's probably what I would suggest right there.
Amazing. And for everybody listening, what we do with every show is any references that we've made to articles or Marty, your books, we'll be sure to reference those links in the show notes so people have easy access to any of the particular links. Marty, it's been an absolute pleasure, sir. Awesome conversation. Really, really do truly appreciate your time. So thank you.
Well, thanks very much for inviting me. I hope it was useful.